I now give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank the briefers for their briefings. The Gaza conflict has persisted for nearly 700 days. Gaza has long become a living hell, with the 2 million Gazan people deeply trapped in a massive man-made catastrophe and over 1 million facing a food security emergency. The international community needs to exhaust every effort possible to prevent further deteriorations. China reiterates that violence cannot bring security, neither can force win peace. Israel's continued escalated military offensives have resulted in the loss of numerous innocent lives daily. Israel's strike on the Al-Nasser hospital on 25th of August killed over 20 civilians, journalists, and medical workers, creating yet another horrendous tragedy. Israel is still moving forward with its military plan to take over Gaza. The plan, once implemented, will inevitably lead to more bloodshed and displacement, adding to the danger and insecurity both Gazans and detained hostages are facing. China objects to and condemns all actions that harm civilians, damage infrastructure, and violate international law. We urge Israel to heed the strong calls from the international community, immediately cease its military operations in Gaza, and immediately halt any dangerous moves that escalate tensions. China further reiterates that violations of international humanitarian law are unacceptable, the weaponization of humanitarian supplies is unacceptable, and the militarization of an aid distribution mechanism is equally unacceptable. All along, the biggest challenge for scaling up humanitarian assistance in Gaza has not been the shortage of supplies or the inadequacies of the UN and other humanitarian agencies. Rather, it has always been the occupying power, Israel's lack of political will, and its deliberately created obstacles. We call on Israel to fulfill its obligations as an occupying power under the international humanitarian law by opening all border crossings, fully restoring humanitarian access, and supporting the UN's delivery of aid consistent with humanitarian principles to truly alleviate the humanitarian disaster on the ground. China reaffirms that the long unfulfilled aspiration for an independent Palestinian state is a fundamental reason preventing the solution to the Palestinian question and the root cause of the recurrent volatility of the Palestinian-Israeli situation. The Palestinian people's right to statehood, right to survival, and right to return must no longer be ignored. Israel's recent approval of a settlement expansion plan in the E1 area of the West Bank will severely undermine the contiguity of the Palestinian territory to the detriment of the foundation of a Palestinian statehood. The international community must build on the positive momentum of the two-state solution, reinvigorate the political prospect of the two-state solution with the utmost urgency, firmly reject any forced displacement of the Palestinian people, and oppose any dangerous attempts to annex the West Bank and Gaza. President, when peace is absent in the Middle East, peace is elusive for the world. At present, the Middle East situation is complex and fragile, with multiple intertwined hotspot issues. Amidst all this, however, the question of Palestine remains central to the Middle East issue. China supports the Council in taking all necessary actions to achieve a ceasefire, ending the fighting in Gaza, and alleviate the humanitarian disaster. We call on all countries, particularly the country with significant influence over the parties concerned, to uphold a just and responsible position and play a constructive part. China will continue to work with the international community towards ending the war in Gaza, advancing the implementation of the two-state solution, and ultimately achieving a comprehensive, just, and lasting solution of the Palestinian question so that both the Palestinian and Israeli peoples can live in shared tranquility and happiness. I thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement, and I give the floor to the Russian Federation. Thank you, Mr. President. We are grateful to today's briefers for their information about the situation in the Gaza Strip. Over the past few days, we, just like many of our colleagues, were stunned by the new data on the record scale of famine in Gaza. These signals and persistent calls to Israel to immediately stop the collective punishment of the Palestinians have been forthcoming from different global capitals, including Moscow, and also international headquarters structures, regional organizations, and representatives of our global organizations throughout the world. Furthermore, the world is calling on West Jerusalem to recognize that there is no alternative to a peaceful settlement to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which would pave the way for establishing genuine peace and security in the Middle East. This is the sole scenario that meets the interests both of the Israelis and all of their neighbors. Today, almost 2 years after the start of the bloody war in Gaza, indeed, it's difficult to find the right words to describe the scale of the destruction and human suffering in the Gaza Strip. The most succinct and at the same time terrifying recent depiction was by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who described the situation in Gaza with one word: hell. The UNRWA Commissioner General, Mr. Lazzarini, characterized the situation in the Strip as bordering on genocide, and the forced population displacement is akin to ethnic cleansing. Such statements in other cases in the assessment of the UN leadership is backed up by daily reports from Gaza about the deaths of dozens of civilians. Just the day before yesterday, indiscriminate strikes by Israel on Gaza killed 70 people. 2 days ago, live on air, as a result of the attacks on the Strip, the Nasser hospital was destroyed and more than 20 people were killed, including 5 journalists. Furthermore, judging by the images in the media, a cynical double-tap strike was used when rescue workers arrived. Even Benjamin Netanyahu already admitted that Israel's direct responsibility for what occurred, calling it a tragic mishap and promising to conduct an investigation. Mr. President, we'd like also to draw your attention to the actions of the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. Since the foundation started its work in May this year, the situation has turned into a completely tragic and unacceptable one. According to various assessments, more than 1,800 Palestinians have died trying to get humanitarian assistance. Thousands of them were near the distribution points that were managed by this pseudo-humanitarian structure. According to reports, strikes on civilians are occurring not only regularly, but also precisely. People in their utter despair spend the night at distribution points and in response get bullets in them. This is no humanitarian mission. This is violence hidden behind good intentions. Under the guise of so-called humanitarian work, there is a policy of fear and intimidation against defenseless civilians. These methods are unacceptable. There's no doubt whatsoever that the work of the Foundation in its current form is dangerous and is not in line with recognized humanitarian principles, and denying this is pointless. Mr. President, given this, we're seriously concerned about reports in the media that the UN Secretariat, allegedly ceding to pressure from Israel and the US, has committed to ratcheting down the rhetoric regarding the GHF. We would like to note that starting from August, whatever the situation in the humanitarian reports in the UN have de facto stopped mentioning the work of this structure. We believe that we hope that these assurances do not reflect reality. We are convinced that the UN Secretariat cannot and should not renounce its principles, namely that humanitarian assistance should not be turned into an instrument of blackmail. We trust that the Secretary General and the humanitarian wing of the UN will consistently and unambiguously advocate for humanitarian assistance to be provided in strict compliance with the norms of international humanitarian law and the principles of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. Mr. President, the horrific statistics of the number of victims caused by the Israeli military operation in Gaza, more than 63,000 Palestinians have died, is in no way stopping the Netanyahu government that has opted to cleanse the densely populated Gaza city and to take total control over the Gaza Strip. West Jerusalem is not sobered either by the opinion of the overwhelming majority of the international community. We'd like to remind you that on the 10th of August, during the emergency meeting of the Security Council, Almost all delegations, including those from Arab and Muslim countries, condemned the new escalatory actions of Israel, underscoring the growing security risks not only to the inhabitants of Gaza, but also to the Israeli hostages held there. We are also surprised that the IDF operation to take Gaza City was started against a background of reports that Hamas had agreed to the proposal of the mediators to release some hostages and to a temporary ceasefire. We are closely following the diplomatic efforts of the mediators inter alia the efforts of Washington. Quite frankly, we do see some discrepancies in the views on how the negotiations are going. American colleagues are always saying that Hamas is refusing to do a deal. The US delegation has been trying to convince the Security Council at least of this over the past few months. At the same time, there are signs that the movement is prepared to do a deal, and Israel is either rejecting the mediator's proposal or is simply expanding the hostilities on the ground and is not demonstrating real interest in reaching agreement. This was publicly announced yesterday in the Qatari media, which, along with the US and Egypt, is participating in the negotiations. We have heard, colleagues, about the American aggressive diplomacy on the ground for some months now, but once again, we regrettably are convinced that it is not giving encouraging results. We would urge our American colleagues to think not only about the interests of Israel that they have been banging on about with great zeal, but also the fate of Palestinian civilians whose lives and futures today, to a large extent, depend on the action or the inaction of this council. Sir, multilateral diplomacy alone, which we are strongly urging our US colleagues to engage in, can and should give a chance to revive the two-state formula. This principle, enshrined in the relevant resolutions of the Security Council and the General Assembly of the UN, today truly is under threat. The reason for this, and in the case of the man-made humanitarian disaster in Gaza that runs counter to international law, is Israel's policy to establish new facts on the ground. The most high-profile was the recent decision by the Higher Planning Committee to approve settlement construction in Area E1 in the West Bank to the east of Jerusalem. We all understand that the implementation of this large-scale expansionist project will breach the contiguity of the territorial integrity of a future Palestinian state, dividing up the West Bank into two isolated enclaves, separate from each other. What is frightening in this regard is not only the concept itself and the unambiguous utterances of Israeli officials. For example, the Minister of Finance, Mr. Smotrich, clearly stated that the plan would permanently bury the idea of a Palestinian state. That's the end of quote. But also that such provocative acts are enjoying support from some American senior diplomats. The US ambassador to Israel, Mr. Mike Huckabee, pointed out that the E1 area construction apparently did not violate international law. Such opinions directly run counter to the foundational documents of Middle East settlement process and also the recent decisions of the Security Council, including Resolution 2334. Mr. President, in conclusion, we'd like to underscore our unwavering stance in favour of having diplomatic settlement alone to the Palestinian question based on the two-state, two-people solution to meet the legitimate concerns of Israel in the area of security and also the rightful expectations of the Palestinian people to their own state. The alternative to this is further isolation of Western Jerusalem and the international scene and the growth and the number of civilian in Gaza victims. Israel is thus not going to solve the problem of its own security, but it would just be simply pushing it off by fostering revenge and hatred among young Palestinians. This is extremely short-sighted and an irresponsible policy. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank Deputy Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, UN Resident and Humanitarian